Good morning and welcome to this week's recruitment discussion with Jumper. This week we're looking at leadership versus the management trap. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button. But for those who have been with us quite a long time, we're going to put some following stats that have come out from Salford University that both impact the decisions that are made by leaders and by managers. And managers seem to focus on the execution and the stability, i.e., the process, while leaders focus on the vision and inspiration, i.e., the people and the strategy. And the key stats that sort of came out from this report were impact on engagement. Managers account for at least 70% of the difference in employee engagement scores. Performance difference, though, organizations excel in both leadership and management can expect to see a 30% higher long term profitability, and growth revenue, strong leadership on average is a 19% higher growth revenue compared to its competitors if they have strong leaders. Natural talent, only 1 in 10 people possess the high natural talent for management, with an additional 2 in 10 showing capabilities that they can be developed. While leadership participation, 70% of leaders who report actively engaging with employees, where less than half the employees believe that their leadership was of high quality. And then there's a big training gap that was quite obvious that they've brought out, that the lack of training, approximately 82% of all UK managers who enter their role enter it without any formal management or leadership training. And higher accuracy, companies reported a fall or a fail to the right person for management in 82% of the cases of the people that they either promoted or recruited into management. So it says there's a huge problem with management and there's a trap between management and leaders. And today we're going to discuss that. So Dave, fresh from his LinkedIn meeting yesterday, I'm sure he's got lots to add from that. So let's push off, Dave, with the first question. We've run large multinational recruitment businesses and our own agencies. And looking back sort of honestly, was there a moment where you realized you were managing everything and leading nothing? And what did that cost before you started to change things?
I've got to say quite simply, there have been lots of moments and they still happen. So it's not one of those things that suddenly I woke up and thought, oh, I'm now a leader as opposed to a manager. It happens regularly. I mean, a key point back in my career, I've been promoted to be a sales director, stroke operations director, and the business wanted me to be in a leadership role. But I was literally stuck in the details, and we've all been there, of actually running the teams of people I had. We had quarterly business reviews. There were feedback from performance reviews. There was an office move. We'd just gone through a rebrand. So there was a whole list of things that I was partly accountable for, that I was literally stuck in the detail of it. And it was that whole thing of, it was do, all of that, but I wasn't really leading. I wasn't lifting my head up and looking ahead to all of these things. What do they actually mean? What do they mean for the organization? Where do they fit into the strategy? My diary was stacked. It was a real management role. And I think what it cost was actually not even trying to take a day or two out and look at where my people were. I knew that that was having a significant effect on performance because I wasn't helping lead those people. I wasn't helping use the skills that I'd been fortunate to gain over the years. And I wasn't spending time with the people. And actually, all of the things that we wanted to do, the rebrand, the office move, all of those exciting things were all predicated on the business performing and accelerating its performance from where it was, which meant that that needed leadership, not management. And I was stuck in the management role. So I don't know in pounds and pence what it cost, but I know we didn't kick off as well as we would have wanted to, having had all these new costs. And to be honest, I still think many of us, me included, get caught in that trap regularly now. And you've got to stop yourself from doing that.
I think it's interesting. 'Cause I think when I started in management, it's strange, and I'll come back to this because one of my team members who sort of fell into my team said, and I asked everybody why they wanted to, because they had a choice whether they wanted to come into my team or whether they recruited a team. And someone said, "Yeah, I'd follow you anywhere." And it took me several years before I asked really why that was. And I think it took me a while to understand that my approach of no shortcuts, you had to do everything by the book, and you know, I wouldn't ask anyone to do anything unless I would done it or have done it, etc. And I think it's when we were constantly reviewing the results so we could improve for the following months that people started to sort of look at that. And then I started to look at my really sort of early days as we start to move through that, where you know I would have that definite impression of I could do everything. I could do it quicker, faster than everybody. And therefore, anyone that asked me a question, I'd take that from them, deliver it back to them as a fait accompli, etc. And I didn't think at the time that it took anything away from my job. When actually it took a while for my performance because I had, set clients that I'd built up, a big client base that I'd built up. It took me about 12 months before my own performance started to dip. And I
Right,
started to realize that my
right.
performance was dipping. So that was costing me because I was now taking all that space that I had in my own day to deliver to clients, to talk to clients, develop my clients, bring in new clients, was suddenly being eaten up by doing everything for everybody else. And I suppose it was until I started to learn to delegate that I started to see the transition. And I think that a lot of managers, when they first go into management, especially looking at the stats, and I was one of those stats that had never had any training to be a manager, that I was micromanaging everybody and thinking because I've now got the management job, it's my job to deliver, when actually it's not your job to deliver, it's the job of the team to deliver. And once I realized that I could deliver the strategy either by myself or by the team, I start to see things change. And I think it's that sort of understanding that if you take the blinkers off as a junior manager and start to look at how you can deliver a business or deliver to the business quicker and faster, it's so more important. And I start to understand, and we've talked about this before in webinars in the past, I started to understand what my effect on the business was, what my ripple effect when I walked into a room, when I came out of the room, what it was like. And once I understood that I had an effect on people, either positive or negative, then I could start to drive performance. But it was only when I started to let go and allow them to perform that I suddenly understood. And I think that's the discipline of being a manager, is that you have to let go of certain things to allow the business to move or allow the team to flurry and the team to grow and move forward from there.
Yeah.
I think there's lots of things that we talk about, and we use words like leading and managing, and they're interchangeable in recruitment, but we've operated at levels across very different businesses. And in practice, sitting in the chair these leaders are sitting in today, or leaders are sitting in today, what is actually the difference between leading and management? And I'm not looking for a textbook answer. I'm looking at sort of what you felt. What is the difference between leading and managing?
Um, yeah, I mean, there's plenty of textbooks. There's plenty of research on the difference in leading and management. For me, when I was a manager and I had teams of people, I was always asking my boss, "How are we going to get there? What do you want from me? What do I need to perform? What do my team need to do? How do we qualify for the trips? How do they qualify for the bonus?" It was a lots and lots of how questions. And as a sales consultant, when I started, they were the sort of questions I asked. The trigger for me when I became a leader was that suddenly it dawned on me that it was my responsibility basically to set the vision. And it was my responsibility to say, this is where we're going. And that was the difference that I learned from asking the question about how we're going to get there and actually saying, this is where we're going. this is what the company wants us to do. Or if when I ran my own business, I set the direction, I set the vision. So it is partly textbook hard, because leadership is about vision. Leadership is about setting the direction and where you're going to go, and then being able to articulate to your management team and your consultants about how you're going to get there and what their role is in it. And we see this all the time in the work that we do with clients now. Um, a lot of the work I do is working with founders on helping them set their vision based on what's going on around. 2025 was a tough year for many of us in recruitment. 2026 started off well, and then there's a war that nobody saw coming and nobody had planned for. And suddenly it feels like, oh, where are we at now? And our role, and the founder's role of recruitment companies, is to set that vision and to encourage and to show, and the managers have to execute on that. So that for me is the difference where I see it in recruitment.
I think it's interesting. I think it's very visceral, the difference. And it took me a while to understand that the difference was headspace. And as a manager, due to my own beliefs when I first started, I could do things better, quicker, faster. I was always being pulled in different directions, responding to issues, reacting to situations, resolving issues. And I think I was the team buffer between them and the directors. And what I
Right.
realized is that if I was getting pulled by my team and being driven to lead by my bosses, that I became piggy in the middle sort of situation. And what I
Right.
found that I was managing, or my manage, I think I found that my management became all consuming. And I think the gaps where, when you manage on a day to day basis, there has to be certain gaps where you lead. And what I found was that those gaps got shorter and shorter, and those gaps actually disappeared after a time. And I'd often find I was leaving work and my head was ready to explode because, I hadn't done my sales job, I hadn't done my managing job, and I certainly wasn't leading people. And I think the good art of management is having a succession plan and getting those people to step it into that plan. So it gives you, or takes the pressure off you, and gives you headspace to think about your next strategic move. And I
Right.
think that's
Right.
the transferring from manager to that strategy people, to a leader. And I think it's about not being stuck in the mud of recruitment every day. I mean, what you're talking about, if you get stuck in the mud every day, tend not to be able to get out of it. And I think it was then about creating conditions for others to perform, others to step up. And my style is always to give them the plaudits on those who deliver and stand at the back and say, well, I've pushed them there, I've led them there, but it's about them taking the plaudits. And I think it's knowing that it's a team effort, but that team effort started with me, but I'm not the star, they are. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think that's the movement from management into leadership. And I think that's what I found really struggled with at the beginning because, I was managing, but that management was all consuming because I was doing everything rather than actually looking at a succession plan of how people could help me to move forward. And that's about how the whole team moving forward. And I think that's what I started to sort of, after a while, really understood and thought, right, I've got to change how I work because, as we said, I was never trained to be a manager. I was never trained to be a leader. And I sort of learned it as I went along and worked from there. I'm going to come back to this question, Gwyn, because Gwyn's asked a question.
Yeah, Quinn's asking a question about energy, and it's a very, really good question.
Yeah, and we will come back to energy, Gwyn, because I think you're right on there. So
Yeah, we're too tired, Gwyn, at the moment, so we'll come back to that later.
I've been managing far too much. So one of the things here at Jump that we talk about is the difference between responsive and being effective. Leading yourself either as a solo business or as a large recruitment agency where volume demands time, that's enormous in recruitment. So, how did you personally break the habit of letting other people, and that's staff, candidates, clients, other people's urgency set your agenda? And how long does it take until you start to work to your own agenda?
Yeah, I think I kind of had a light bulb moment. I don't know, 20 years ago. Yeah, I'd been fortunate to to lead a business that then got sold into a much bigger business that then I stayed on in that business and kind of more by luck and judgment, I think I ended up running it. And so suddenly there's more demands all the time. And my light bulb moment was realizing that I lived in a state where I didn't own my time. The time was not my own. And once I realized that, and that's not as negative as it sounds, once I realized that actually everybody else, yeah, was going to need a little bit more of me, or they were going to ask some questions, or there could be management questions, leadership questions, challenging things happen with clients. And I realized actually this isn't my time. Yeah, I'm there to help lead a part of the business and then yeah, later on the whole business. And I looked at things differently then. So instead of trying to think, well, what can I do? What can I do? I've got to carve this bit of time out. I've got to carve that out. I kind of went with the flow. And there was an image that a leadership consultant that I had heard, didn't see live, said, You're like a boat on the water, like when you make a paper boat and it goes down the river. Yeah, it's often very calm. And you watch that little paper boat float down the river. That's what leadership can be like. And it really sent a good message to me because it stopped me stressing about all the things that I couldn't do, all of the meetings I couldn't attend or the one-to-ones I couldn't do. It became a little bit more calm. And I realized actually time isn't my own. I've got to find how I make the best use of what I do. And that was my challenge. That was my leadership challenge as well. How do I find the time to make the best use of what I do? And that applies now, even when we're running Jump is a very niche boutique place. There's 5 or 6 of us involved in it, plus our partners. That still applies from back in the days when there were, 1,600 people and 15 offices. You recognize time's not your own. You've got to decide what you do with it. And that was a light bulb moment for me.
I think it's interesting. I'm not going to say I had a similar light bulb moment, but I'm just going to say I had a light bulb moment. And that was that habits are deeply ingrained with us, and breaking habits are really hard, especially when you're either have no role model or there's no one around you doing the same thing. So you can't see the wood for the trees. And I think that, like you, my agenda was getting taken by everybody else. And I wasn't working on whether I should let them take the agenda or not. But because we reward on these habits, it's hard often to feel the continuity to break the habits and introduce the team to new ones. But we
Yeah,
also need to
yeah.
commit and be accountability to the change of habits. And those change of habits was what dictated my agenda. And I remember sort of a certain thing that I did. I looked at where I was losing time and I looked where I could gain my time. So I started to address me first, what I was doing, which wasn't time productive and wasn't producing anything. And I remember one of the first things that I did when I did this with the team was when I was at CP, I first went in there and I was going through Monday morning sales meetings and I was going through what we should be doing the team that week, how we would work, and mobile phones were going off. People were picking the phone, speaking to managers, etc., etc. So this was taking an awful long time, and it was their agenda, really, not my agenda, because it's their meeting. But also, their agenda was then being delivered by taken up by their clients and their candidates taking calls. So I introduced a no phones in the sales meeting, which ended up having lots of moans about, lots of complaints originally that our clients and candidates can't in touch with us, etc., etc. But I stuck to my guns. And what I found was the meetings became more powerful because people had to concentrate on the meetings. They became quicker because there wasn't so much interruption, people
Yeah,
stepping in and
yeah.
out. And they ensured that everyone knew what was expected by the end of the week and what we were looking at. And so the constant travel levels in those meetings hugely increased. And I created the habit of timing by saying if the meeting starts at 8:45, it starts at 8:45, not 8:46, not 8:44, at 8:45. So people who walked in late to the meeting, I just ignored them and carried on the meeting. They had to catch up. After a while, everyone's in at 8:45. Everyone knew what the habits were. And what that started to do was create discipline across the team. And that
Yeah,
discipline was
yeah,
about managing everybody else's time and not being reactive. And I said, just because a client sent you an email or a client's made you a call, it's not your urgency. That's their urgency. So why are we looking after that urgency? So, you know, that discipline to move forward, and it gave them the habits. And the other thing that I did was I started to discipline my team in answering their own questions. So I said, every time you come and ask me a question, the first thing I'm going to say to you is, how do you think you should answer that question? And 9 times out of 10, they'd answer it right. 9 times out of 10, I could say,
yeah,
great, off you go. And what I started to find was that people would stand up and go, H, and I'd go, what? And they go, oh, hang on a minute, I've just sorted it. And I go, what? And they go, don't worry about it, I've just sorted it. Because it was easy for them to ask me and me to give them the answer than it was to think of their answer themselves. But as soon as they started to think for the answer themselves, their inward sort of feeling of goodness sort of built, because they started to realize they knew what they were talking about and they knew what they could do. And that gave me more time. But it also gave them more time because
yeah,
they weren't having to sit and me go through an answer and then
yeah,
go, oh, yeah, I know that, I know that, I know that. And what it created was time and efficiency in there. So I think when we start to think about, using your agenda, I think it's about time. And I think you've got to sort of think about what is your agenda, what's on your agenda, how do you deliver that? And don't pander to other people's agendas. So people sending you emails, etc., because that's their urgency, not yours. And once we created that, we created a team that would really quickly and move really fast. And that's the sort of thing that I wanted to embed and embedded. And then what you found was natural leaders emerged within that team. And I had the confidence then and the discipline to manage them, but also they had the confidence and discipline to manage themselves when I wasn't in the room. And everyone talks about the effects of a leader, a good leader, a good manager is what happens when you're not in the room. And that was it, by giving them the responsibility and accountability for their own actions, something there. And it took a massive amount of time off my plate and meant that I could use agenda to drive business forward rather than be pandering to everybody else's agenda. And
yeah,
it took me a while to learn that, but it was
yeah.
a real interesting thing. Um, that obviously leads into the obvious question about delegation. Every recruitment leader we speak to says that they want to delegate more, but I would say quite a lot of them we come across and meet don't do it very well. So, what does good delegation actually look like in a recruitment business? And can you give us some honest examples of the ones that nearly went wrong and what you learned from them?
Well, I'm working with a business right now where the objective for the MDs of the business is to grow their second line. And the issue for them is I'm not sure they completely trust their second line. So they are prepared to delegate, but not trust. So therefore they micromanage. And where it goes wrong is when you delegate, but you don't trust the person that you've delegated the work to deliver. You're too close, you're asking too many questions, you're micromanaging, you're not taking feedback for yourself. And that's where delegation doesn't work because actually all you're doing is giving someone else some work to do, but you haven't freed up any of your own time because you're checking on them. If they're ready to do it and you've given them the skills to do it, then let them get on with it. If you haven't given them the skills to do it, don't delegate. Train them, spend some time with them, get them to understand why it is they're doing this work, what the importance of that work is, and then let them get on with it. And a little bit more time. So what I learned was a little bit more time up front in terms of with the people I was going to delegate the responsibilities to, saved an awful lot of time in checking on them and also it encouraged them. It gave them confidence and it gave them viability also within the organization. Actually, Dave trusts them to do this. We believe in Dave. We believe in the company. We're going to follow these people. So I think before you delegate, you've got to ask yourself as a leader the honest question, am I comfortable with them doing it? Have I given them all the tools that they need so they can take on that work? And then am I happy to let them get on with it?
It's interesting, isn't it? That I think our questions will, or answers to this question will overlap quite a bit. And I think there are three different types of people that you delegate to. And the space that you allow them then to perform is really critical. And therefore, looking at those people is really important. I think the first person is the person who you think is capable to deliver. So without constantly intervening, allowing them to form, to make mistakes, because you know there's going to be mistakes there. I think it's allowing these people to actually get on with the job, get out of their way and let them actually do the things that they need to be doing and then
Yeah.
follow up and from there. The
Yeah.
second person is the one that needs that little bit of support. So you delegate certain parts of the project to them and then help them deliver the rest. But by helping them deliver the rest, you're developing their habits and the understanding of the process that they need to be doing. And these people are sometimes not afraid of making mistakes, but you have to have their back when they make sure you encourage them. And the third person is someone who shows management potential or got management traits, but they worry about making mistakes. They worry about the process. And to me, then I would lead them by the hand through that process a couple of times before they can do that. And I remember two very clear examples, one in my very early days of recruitment and one in my when I was running my own business. In my early days, I had a lady who was grooming to be my second in command who was absolutely brilliant. And I delegated a task to her. And I remember thinking it's quite an important task, this needs to be done. And I kept treating her like the third person, worried for her to make a mistake, worried that she didn't know the process, kept intervening, kept helping her, kept pointing out. And then she turned around and told me, stop babysitting me. And that really sort of sat me on my heels. Stop babysitting me. And so I
Yeah.
flippantly said to her, right, you just deliver it. And wow, did she deliver. And so I
Yeah.
learned a very valuable lesson about understanding the people's skills and giving them their own headspace and not filling my headspace with their problem. Okay. And the second one was it was a bit about based on a consultant that was working for me as a resourcer initially, and going through one of his reviews, he'd hit all his criteria to hit promotion to become a salesperson. He was desperate to do that job, and there was just something that said to me that he's not a salesperson. He's not going to make it. So we went through everything. I said, look, you're a brilliant resourcer. I never want to lose you from the business. And it's the first time I sort of said this at sort of any sort of time when promoting people, because this almost sort of says that you're going to fail. And I said, you're a brilliant resourcer. I never want you to lose you from the business. So if the promotion starts to feel like it's taking its toll and it's not working, speak to me and we can change things before it's too late. And strangely enough, 6 months later, he came back to me because he was failing. And he came back to me and said, look, it's not working. I'm very overwhelmed by what's going on. I'd like to get back to my position. So I made a bigger position for him from a resources point of view, and he excelled again. 18 months later, he asked for the same thing. And I said, I'm going to say exactly the same thing I told you 18 months ago. He went, I know you are. I said, and that's why I want to try again, but I want to just, for my own sake, feel that I'm ready. And he tried, and again, he failed, and it was nothing to do with him. It's just he wasn't that type of person. And it was strange. He came back. He then worked for me for some time on with that. He's now head of one of the largest global SaaS companies, head of their recruitment. And it's
Man.
about finding people their
Yeah.
spaces and giving them,
Yeah.
allow them to make mistakes. Where I think if I'd have done that at CP, he'd have gone because there would have been no stepping backwards and there'd been the embarrassment. But you want to create a culture where people feel free to step backwards. And I think if people don't trust you, then they leave. But if people trust you've got their best interests at heart, they will step forwards and backwards in the roles in there. So I think to me, that's the bit about delegation is delegating things to people and delegating performance, but also delegating their opportunity. And it's those type of things I think that good managers and good leaders develop and work from. I'm going to try throw Gwyn's question about energy into this question because I think it's got
Yes. Yeah.
the right connotations.
Yeah. Yeah.
Burnout in recruitment leadership is rarely sudden. It builds over a long period of time. Okay. And we've worked with lots of recruitment leaders across lots of businesses, with lots of people inside the business and outside, and people that we've managed and coached, etc. We've probably seen this pattern many times. So the question is, what are the early signs that recruitment leaders are heading towards burnout, though trying to do everything to prevent it? And what do most of them do when they first see those signs in themselves?
And I think it does come back to Gwyn, your question on energy. Recruitment is a brilliant industry that if you're good at it and you have the right energy, you do the right things, you can grow fast. There are plenty of recruiters who in their late 20s, even earlier, that set up their own businesses and perform and succeed really well. And there's not many industries that you can do that in. So, but a lot of it is about how you are as a person. And do you give off the right vibes? Are you supporting people? Are you encouraging people? You use the word trust, Howard. Are you trusting of people? Are they trusting of you? But a lot of that is around the energy that you progress, that you show, because we want to follow good people who give off good energy and good vibes and aren't showing those burnout signs. And my thing here is if you are showing any of that, are you taking feedback from your staff? Do you have a culture where your staff can say to you, you know what, Gwyn, Dave, Howard, or whatever, I think you're a bit tired, or I think you need a bit of a break, or whatever, without you flying off at them because they've dared to question what you're doing, or they've dared to question your leadership. And it's a really important point to say you do need to take stock. I'm working with a CEO who very, very proudly said to me he hasn't had a holiday properly for 6 months. And I don't know whether he thought that that's what I wanted to hear. Yeah. And it's like, no, 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 you need your breaks. However it is, you need to recharge. You can't just keep going because otherwise the battery burns out. If you're an EV and you just keep it going, it just burns out. So you need to know yourself. What are the great traits of leadership? And really good leaders display this. They know themselves. They know when they've gone a bit too far. They know when they need to step back. They know when they need a break. They know to keep themselves fit, to keep themselves going. Yeah, that's a good sign of leadership. And they receive feedback when they know that isn't the case. So if you're in that stage where you're feeling a little bit of burnout, catch it in the early days, listen, learn. There's no excuse in these days for not learning how to deal with it. There's many, many different ways. We won't go through them all now, but just catch yourself, as the Irish would say, catch yourself on. Stop that and just take a step back. Because if you're 5% off, your team will be 10% off. And you can't afford for that to happen, particularly when in this crazy world in which we live, where everything is so turbulent, people want to be led. People want to be shown the way and shown how to do it. And it's your responsibility, absolutely your responsibility as a leader, to lead with that effervescent energy, but that also takes stock of the situation and knows how to act in different situations.
It's an interesting conversation, is it, about energy? Because I don't think energy is about this being 100% fully on it constantly.
No.
I think energy comes in very different shapes and forms and how you perform with individuals, groups, and teams. And I think, burnout's one of those sort of things. I've certainly witnessed it happen quite a few times. And before I sort of outline the signs, I think what normally happens is the person tries to ignore the signs. They blame or they have excuses for things that are happening, but they never seem to admit the issues out loud to others. And I think that's, naturally we don't want to feel that we're a failure or fragile, so we tend not to sort of move those things. I remember I had a high performing manager that I was pushing them to go further because I thought they had the capability. And what I didn't know until I started spotting the signs that they were having sort of issues outside of work. And the signs from that person was they started to come to work early and leave late, but their results were disappearing and dropping. And I couldn't understand why they were in early, why they were late, what they were actually doing. They were getting agitated, the smallest sort of thing, right? And those sort of things never bothered before. They were late with assignments, reports, they were late to some meetings. And I felt that when they were in the meetings, they weren't actually in the meetings. And that just being part and engaging is part of energy. And I think, and so I quietly took this person to one side and asked if they're okay. Did they need anything from me? And I got sort of short change. And, I could see the walls almost coming up straight away about, I don't want to be talking to you, etc., things like that. So I started quietly triaging their workload and looking at what was happening. And I found they'd slipped back into micromanagement to a certain degree and were just demanding things from people because that was easier than making the right call. And so rather than telling them that they were going wrong and correcting them, teaching them to sort of suck eggs, I started to ask them if they were okay. Are you okay? And if they said yeah, I asked again, no, are you really okay? And if they said yeah again, then I'd believe it. But then I'd ask again and again. And I think with this person, it took about 3 or 4 weeks before they actually said, no, there's a problem. And it was that constant, are you okay? And then just leaving it because they'll tell you in their own terms. And it was during a monthly review that this person stopped and sort of told me what the issues was. And then we started to look at, right, how can I help? How can we change things? What can we do? And what the person didn't realize is what effect it was having on them and therefore what effect it was having on their team. They thought they hadn't changed. They thought they'd masked it really well, and that there was little micro changes and things that they didn't realize. And it was a hard conversation to have, but it was a conversation where there was no blame. It was just
Yes.
facts.
Yeah.
How do
Yeah.
we move these forwards?
Yeah.
And so when we started working on lightening the load, delegating things out to others, I sort of checked in more with them. But on the quiet, I got HR to help. Okay. We worked through the process, and over time, this person's performance massively improved. They stayed in the business, they stayed there for a long time. And one thing they said to me was, it was, you gave me the headspace to actually think and breathe. You gave me the headspace to move, where before I was just encompassed in my own little world. And I think a lot of leaders at the top get encompassed in their own little world, and therefore burnout happens. And so I learned so much from that event. But what I did learn was that, no one else in the business knew that was going on, just me, the HR person, and the person involved. But acknowledging that, trying to turn someone around and supporting them and having their back when they're going through a bad time is really important. And it's those type of things. This person now's gone on and is leading a large recruitment agency up in the Northwest, and it's those type of things that I think as a manager and a leader that I would class as my big successes, rather than we've built this amount of money. It's how you look after your people. And you can see people that are getting into that situation in burnout, and it's how you sort of sit down and address that. And that goes back to that energy, when you don't have to be sort of 99 miles an hour all the time. Sometimes the energy could be 1 mile an hour. A 1 mile an hour movement makes other people move at 1 mile an hour. That means you're moving at 2 miles an hour. You can drive and you can start to gather momentum. Energy is a creation of two things rubbing together. And I think when people sort of rub together and sort of join together, you get a far better performance than if they're like two magnets just pushing away from each other from there. So I think there's a lot of things to be said about energy, but I think that you've got to look at how you apply it. You can't be the same effervescent person every single day, because it just
No, it
isn't
doesn't work.
doesn't work.
No.
We talk about protected thinking time, and I think you were sort of alluding to this in the last question. We talk about protected thinking time as a strategy necessary rather than a luxury. But in recruitment business, the culture where it's pace, it's responsive, it's results, taking yourself off to think about what should happen next feels almost transgressive. How do you protect your own thinking time when you're running a business? And what happens to decisions you make when you actually give yourself the space to make them properly?
It's funny because when I was running a bigger business, my thinking time was often my journey in and out of work. So I love to drive. And if I had a choice to drive to work or to take the train, I would drive. And I've got music on, or I've got nothing on, or I'm listening to something. But that was always my thinking time. Now, I was fortunate that I was responsible for a collective number of offices where often I would have to drive to Leeds or to Chesham or to Bristol or whatever. And you listen to people say, "Oh, on the train you can do your laptop work, you can do your work, you can do." Of course, that makes sense. But for me, the effective time was that time on my own. So I try to build in, and still do. I'll go for a walk. I'll listen to a podcast or something where I intentionally carve out some time for myself to think about what's going on. Now, we're in roles now, which is different, where we are accountable to the founders of a number of different businesses rather than just one when we were working for ourselves. So it's important for me to have that time to think because each of the challenges are different for different businesses in the positions that they're in. So you just have to learn how to carve out some time to think, to look ahead as well. And the other aspect of leadership, because leadership is very much relational. So it's about building relations with people, with clients, with your staff, or whatever. Management is much more operational. And from a relational point of view, you've got to have things to say. You've got to bring new things to the relationship. What's going on in the world. Just being at LinkedIn yesterday, you find out a lot more stuff that you just didn't know. So yesterday for me was almost like thinking time because although I was contributing, I'm not for most of it, I wasn't. So I'm learning. And then in learning, you're finding out what's going on. You can bring that to your clients because your clients and your staff have an expectation that you have all the answers. And of course, we know that we don't, but you do have to develop some time and carve out some time so you can be aware of what's going on. Because relationally, strategically, that's what leaders do. Operationally, there's things that everybody has to do, and that's the management side of things.
I think it's interesting because I think I've got a very similar sort of viewpoint. I remember when I was a salesperson, based in Leeds at Lorient, I was lucky enough to get picked up by Sale in Manchester to play rugby. So traveling across the M62 at rush hour, 90-minute journey, leaving at 5:30. So I had to make sure I was above target. Otherwise, my manager would scowl at me and what have you. And if I wasn't above target, I would generally stay. But that gave me clear thinking time about work.
Yeah, yeah.
But what was interesting was on the way home, I'd be thinking about rugby. I was going through the game in my head. So it gave me a natural time to switch off. And obviously, training gives you a natural time to switch off because if you don't switch on, some 19 stone lunatic's going to take you out. As I moved to non billing manager, I'd retired at that stage from rugby, but I was still doing martial arts. And it was the same sort of thing. If you don't switch on the mats, someone's going to kick or punch you in the head. And well, I suppose looking at my face, most people probably think I don't switch off at all. But, it's that thing that I found that once I'd switched off, so finding ways to switch off, my decision making became much better. The clarity of what I was looking at became much better. And sometimes when I started to get really busy and looking after multiple offices, I had about at one stage looking after 12, 13 offices, I'd book an hour in my diary every day. And that hour in my diary was for me to do whatever I wanted to do. So again, I wasn't then beholden to someone else's agenda. That was my hour, my time, and what I took. And I think that probably prevented me from burning out because it enabled me to do whatever I want. And I'd go for a walk, I'd do various different things, what have you. But I think switching off becomes a habit and switching on becomes a habit. And I think you've got to create the right habits and the right routines. And I think a lot of managers and directors and owners, leaders never create a routine because they're so reactive to what's going on around them. They never create a routine. And I would sometimes never classify a weekend as a weekend because, to me, work was all consuming, etc. But you'd still have to switch off. And it was the switching off to me that made my decision making process so much cleaner, so much better. And without that, I think I'd have struggled big time as a manager and as a leader, and I wouldn't have got anywhere I'd like to have got. Okay. So the final question, and this is I'm going to make this a bit more personal for us. Okay. If you could go back to the version of yourself that was running a recruitment business, caught between leading and management, trying to do everything and burning through energy, trying to do it perfectly, what would you tell yourself? And what would you know now from the other side and your experiences that you've had advising people that you wish someone had told you when you were in the midst of your management career?
This is a really easy one for me. And it may not be the answer you'd expect, but somebody reminded me very early on in my career, this is not the most important thing in your life. And when we run our businesses, and we want success, or we demand success, or we expect success, you get lost in it. But actually, for me, my faith, my family, and then it was the business. And you can argue that, well, your family won't succeed if you don't succeed, your business doesn't succeed. All of that I get. But actually, how you are as a person, what you do as a person, how you are with your kids. I've got lots of kids, as you know. Regard my responsibility as a dad to make sure that they can make their way in the world. For me, that's more important than anything I'll ever do in my business. I love recruitment. I love what we do here. And I love what Job does. I've always enjoyed the jobs that I've had, but I've always been being very, very mindful that it isn't the most important thing. And I can say that as a Christian. I can say that from what we do in our church with people who are far more worthy of our time than I could give. But that matters more to me than anything I'll ever do in recruitment. But I adore recruitment. I adore what I do. I really love our industry. But I also need that balance sometimes to be reminded it isn't the most important thing.
It's interesting. I started to write just little notes on this question, and said one of the things I said: don't dwell on mistakes.
Right,
It's happened. You can't
right.
dwell on it. You've got to move forward.
Yeah,
Address things early. You know, the longer you leave things, the harder it is sometimes to address them, and be bold. As a manager, I was always quite outspoken. I was always bold. I always did the things. And as a manager, I tried to manage myself as I'd managed others. There was
yes,
no
yes.
differentiation
Yeah, yeah,
between there. So
yeah.
delegation became part of that. Succession planning became part of that. But I think it was the big question about you're going to make mistakes. Don't dwell on them. Work out how you can make things better. Move forward. And one of the things that I learned very quickly was, everybody will have some form of advice for you. It's your choice to listen to it, and it's your choice whether you accept it or implement it. Not all advice is great advice, but some little things suddenly change. And I got things from people in. I got things from certain people that made me really, really focus on what I was doing. And I think Gwen's just sort of stolen my last comment, which was believing what you're doing.
Yes, yeah.
Believe that. So
Great comment.
if someone gave me a target and I thought, right, we can hit that, it's right, let's work it down. And I work it down to the smallest micron degree and say, right, we can definitely smash that and work from there. And so it was the belief, but it was the belief in myself and the belief in, what I could succeed at. Okay. And that didn't matter whether I was playing rugby, martial arts, walking down the street, looking after my kids, work, etc. It was the belief that I would be able to complete what I set out to do. And I think that's the things that we're looking at. So this is the end of this week's 4-week series. So we're going to develop a new series for the next 4 weeks, as starting off next week. As always, with these sessions, if you want the workbook from this session, there is a workbook from this session. Please send it to info@jumpadvisory.com and just put workbook in the subject line, and I'll send you across the workbook. Ladies and gents, thanks for your time. Dave, thanks for your time, and we look forward to seeing you all again next week.
Have a great week, everyone.
Cheers,
Be
everyone.
good leaders.